My CEO fired me mid-Cyberattack so his nephew could take my position. Minutes later, $6.2 billion locked itself away. And his entire empire collapsed. Lines of hostile code poured into our network like floodwater through broken levees. I sat rigid at my console, typing with every ounce of speed I had, patching breaches faster than I could breathe. Treasury nodes were flashing red. Firewall alerts screamed across 5 continents. My headset buzzed with frantic voices from Singapore, Frankfurt, and New York. I was holding the line alone. Then, through the chaos, Damian Aldridge's voice thundered across the war room. Enough. You're done here. Pack up your things. For a moment, I thought I had misheard him. I was fighting to keep $6.2 billion from evaporating in real time. And the CEO was firing me, not privately, not in a quiet office, but in front of executives, engineers, and his smug nephew waiting in the wings. I am Marin Quell, Chief Security Architect of Strathmore Global. For 15 years, I built the invisible fortress that kept this empire safe. I had drafted the protocols, negotiated the insurance clauses, and trained staff who now stared at me with wide, uncertain eyes. Nights bled into mornings at my desk. My personal life shrank to scraps. I gave everything to ensure Strathmore never fell to exactly the kind of siege we faced that morning. And yet here I was, discarded with a single command. Damian Aldridge never wrote a line of code in his life. He rose on charisma and politics. His speeches were heavy with buzzwords, his hands were heavy with deals struck in smoke-filled rooms. He prized appearances over substance, bold optics over real resilience. To him, I was an artifact of the past. To me, he was a hollow figurehead gambling with the company's survival. Cut her access, he barked again, eyes burning with disdain. She's obsolete. Get her out. The sting wasn't just in the dismissal, it was in the humiliation in front of my team. I was branded outdated, irrelevant, unworthy. My screen went black. My credentials dissolved with a keystroke. Gasps filled the room. Shock coursed through me, but no sound left my lips. I didn't plead. I didn't scream. I rose, collected my bag, and walked toward the exit. My silence weighed heavier than any protest. When my badge flashed red at the door, the room knew exactly what Damian had done. The red light blinked again when I swiped it at the elevator. Access denied. The metal doors that had opened for me every day for 15 years now refused to recognize my existence. I tried again, as if the system might change its mind, but the same sharp beep confirmed the truth. I had been erased. I stood there for a moment, holding the useless piece of plastic in my hand. Only 30 minutes earlier, I was the architect defending a global fortress worth billions. Now I was nothing more than a dismissed employee being watched by security guards who pretended not to know me. Betrayal never lands all at once. It seeps in second by second, like poison in the blood. I walked toward the lobby, heels clicking against the marble floor. My reflection fractured in the polished tiles. People stepped aside, whispering. They had seen Damian humiliate me, strip me of my role in the middle of a war. To them, I was now a cautionary tale. Loyalty means nothing. Competence even less when arrogance holds the microphone. As I passed the row of glass offices, memories pressed against me like ghosts. The first year when I worked 18-hour days building the prototype firewall, the nights I fell asleep on my keyboard, waking to find cold coffee beside lines of unfinished code, the birthdays I missed, the anniversaries cut short, the apologies I whispered to my family when Strathmore always came first. Every sacrifice I made felt like a coin tossed into the well of trust, believing it would one day be honored. But Damian had shattered the well in an instant. 15 years traded for spectacle. I reached the ground floor. The lobby was buzzing, executives rushing, phones ringing off the hook. Everyone knew the company was under siege, yet eyes still darted toward me, some curious, others pitying. None spoke, none except one. A young analyst, barely out of college, broke away from the crowd. He kept his voice low, as if afraid Damian might hear through the walls. "We trust you, not him," he whispered. His eyes held both fear and defiance. It was a brief moment, a flicker of solidarity in a building drowning in obedience, but it was enough to pierce the fog of humiliation wrapping around me. I wanted to thank him, but words tangled in my throat. Instead, I gave the smallest nod, and he slipped back into the swarm as if nothing had happened. I stepped out into the sharp daylight, the glass tower of Strathmore looming behind me like a monument built on my labor, now casting me aside as if I had never existed. I gripped my bag tighter, the weight of years was heavy on my shoulder. The betrayal burned, but the humiliation cut deeper, not because I had been fired, people lose jobs every day, but because of how it was done, publicly, cruelly, at the very moment my hands were defending the company from collapse. As I walked down the block, I thought of my family. I thought of the dinners missed, the school recitals I was absent from, the calls ignored because I was always one line of code away from solving a crisis. Strathmore had consumed me. And in return, it devoured me whole. But in the silence between my footsteps, one thought stayed. That young voice saying, "We trust you, not him." It was a seed, fragile but alive. And as humiliation pressed against my chest, I realized betrayal can crush loyalty, but it cannot erase truth. Someone still saw me. The war room that had once pulsed with controlled urgency now dissolved into chaos. Screens blared red alerts. Sirens howled. The chatter of keyboards turned into the desperate clatter of panic. Without me at the console, the breach spread like wildfire. The hackers, sensing the absence of resistance, moved faster, drilling through layers of security I had built years ago. "Node 12 is gone," someone shouted. "They've bypassed the Frankfurt hub," another cried. Executives who once strutted in with confidence now hovered near the walls, pale and frozen, as if clinging to the idea that someone else would fix it. But there was no one else. I had been the safeguard, the last defense, and Damian had just thrown it away. He stood at the center of the storm, his voice rising above the chaos, barking orders that made no sense. Lock them out. Shut the system down completely. His nephew stood beside him with a laptop he barely understood, repeating commands to the IT staff like an actor reading lines from a script. None of it worked. Every attempt to push the intruders back was met with new penetrations, deeper and sharper. Panic fed on itself. Executives clutched phones, calling regulators, calling insurers, calling anyone who might grant relief. But the breach didn't care about bureaucracy. It advanced with mathematical precision, tearing through accounts, contracts, digital treasuries worth billions. And then, almost too perfectly, the outer firewall collapsed. The team gasped as alerts blinked, primary barrier compromised. Data pathways lit up on the screen like veins carrying infection straight to the heart. Damian slammed his fist against the table. "Who built this garbage?" he roared. His nephew stammered excuses, blaming outdated code, outdated strategy, outdated me. My name, Marin, became a curse spat across the room. But the collapse wasn't failure. It was design. Years earlier, I had coded a safeguard known only to me and two trusted engineers. The outer firewall was never meant to hold indefinitely, it was a decoy, a facade designed to crumble under pressure. When it fell, it triggered the activation of the deep lock system, a buried protocol that wrapped the core servers in an impenetrable shell. There was a catch. The lock only opened with one thing, my digital signature. The system flashed a demand across every console in the war room: authorization required, quell, The IT staff stared at the prompt as if it were written in another language. Damian leaned over, face reddening, demanding they override it. Bypass it. Break it. It's impossible, one engineer whispered. The lock isn't just encryption. It's biometric. Without her, we're locked out too. Helplessness spread like contagion. The executives who had stood silent during my humiliation now realized what had happened. They had applauded Damian's cruelty, or at least tolerated it. And now they were trapped inside a fortress that no longer recognized them as allies. Damian refused to accept it. "Call the insurance firm. Activate the clause," he demanded. Phones rang, but the answer was the same: policy requires the signature of the chief security architect of record. That role had been terminated less than an hour ago. Inside the room, tension melted into despair. The hackers hammered at the outer layers, but now they found nothing to exploit. The deep lock had sealed everything behind the signature they could never forge. The system wasn't breached, it was frozen. Assets untouchable, but also unreachable. Billions of dollars sat in digital vaults, locked in darkness, while the men who had orchestrated my downfall clawed at glass they couldn't break. And in that war room, the helplessness grew unbearable. Every eye turned toward Damian, not with respect, not with obedience, but with the dawning realization that his arrogance had doomed them all. The war room had gone strangely quiet. The alarms still screamed across the screens, the breach alerts still flashed crimson, but the noise inside the humans had dulled to a stunned silence. Every attempt to wrest control from the deep lock had failed. Damian's face, flushed with rage minutes ago, now tightened with something different, fear. He straightened his jacket as if appearance could anchor authority and snapped toward the CFO. Call the insurance provider again. That's what we're paying for. Phones clicked, calls were placed, executives leaned in, desperate for a lifeline. On speaker, the insurance liaison's voice came through, calm but cold, like a surgeon delivering a terminal diagnosis. Mr. Aldridge, we've received your notice of cyber event. Unfortunately, we cannot activate coverage at this time. The policy stipulates authorization from your chief security architect of record. Without that signature, the claim cannot proceed. The word struck heavier than any alarm. Executives exchanged nervous glances. The CFO stammered, but she's gone. We terminated her this morning. Then the policy is void, the voice replied flatly. Clause 14b single point authorization. No exceptions. Damian's nephew slammed his laptop shut as if the sound could drown out the truth. That's insane, he barked. There must be another way. But there wasn't. Every insurer, every contract I had ever fought to negotiate had one common thread: security depends on trust, and trust depends on accountability. That's why my digital signature, the same one Damian had just deleted, was the trigger. Without it, the safety net was gone. The cold realization seeped into the room. It wasn't just that the breach continued, it was that the billions they had thought were insured were now dangling unprotected in the storm. The fortress hadn't just been breached, it had been stripped of its parachute. One executive whispered, "Didn't we used to have dual signatories back when Robert Chong was deputy?" Heads turned. That memory cut deeper than any attack. Yes, once upon a time, Strathmore's insurance could be activated by two people, myself or the deputy architect. It was redundancy, the industry standard. But last year, Damian had strutted into a quarterly meeting, bragging about how he had streamlined costs and eliminated redundant signatories. I remembered it clearly. He had laughed about saving a few $100,000 in premiums. Why pay for two signatures, he boasted, when one is enough? Besides, Marin will always be here. Now the irony hung in the air like a guillotine. The very decision he had trumpeted as efficiency was the knife severing their last hope. The CFO, pale as paper, lowered his phone. They won't move, he said softly. Without Quell's digital token, the insurance is a dead letter. Damian's mask cracked. He slammed both fists against the table, rattling coffee cups and keyboards. Then forge it. Find a way to replicate her key. The lead IT engineer shook his head. Impossible. The token is biometric, bound to her credentials and retinal scan. Even if she were willing to help, only she can activate it. And she isn't here. Another muttered agreement. Silence followed. It wasn't the silence of strategy or patience, it was the silence of realization, the weight of inevitability settling on their shoulders. Billions once thought safe had vanished from protection, exposed to the chaos outside while the system still held under the deep lock. But if it cracked, and it would eventually, there would be nothing left to shield them. No insurer, no payout, just ruin. Damian turned in a slow circle, eyes darting at the people who had once applauded his bravado. Now those same eyes burned with quiet blame. He wanted someone else to carry the weight, someone else to explain why his empire was collapsing. But there was no one left to point to except himself. Cold realization spread across the room. Strathmore was not under attack by hackers. It was being gutted from the inside by its own arrogance, and the hand on the knife was Damian Aldridge's. The clock in the war room read 10 a.m. when the final blow landed. Markets don't scream, but the silence they leave behind is deafening. Screens that once charted steady growth now displayed plunging lines, red arrows stabbing downward. Traders began freezing transactions. Investors halted orders. Within minutes, Strathmore's stock price spiraled into freefall. Phones rang like alarms, but not the kind anyone could answer. Executives clutched them with trembling hands, listening to shouts on the other end, "What's happening? Why can't we move our assets? Why are our accounts frozen?" Each question was a knife. No one had an answer they dared give aloud. The CFO's voice cracked as he read off numbers that sank lower by the second. Down 12% in the first 3 minutes, 20% now. Trading volume frozen on the London Exchange. His tone grew fainter, like a man calling out from underwater. Damian stood stiff, shoulders squared in denial, as if posture could defy math. "This will pass," he muttered too loudly, as if repeating the phrase could turn panic into stability. "It's a glitch, a temporary dip. The markets will correct." But dread spread faster than his lies. Everyone in the room saw what he refused to acknowledge. Strathmore's empire was collapsing in real time, and none of them could stop it. Then came the chime. A new alert flashed across every terminal, every shared screen in the room. It wasn't from the hackers. It wasn't even from the system itself. It was an automatic transmission routed straight to the U.S. Securities and Exchange Commission. The words blazed in bold across the screen: "Incident report, security architect terminated mid-event. Risk assessment compromised. Coverage void." Gasps filled the room. It was no longer speculation, no longer whispers among frightened staff. The very system Damian had dismissed me for defending had now declared, in permanent record, the truth of what he had done. One executive whispered, "This went public." "Yes," the compliance officer said weakly. "The auto-report protocol is tied to federal regulations. Once a company's architect of record is removed during a live breach, the system notifies regulators directly." The realization hung like a noose. Damian hadn't just humiliated me. He had documented his own arrogance for the world. Regulators now had proof. Investors had proof. And markets already responded as if the company were on fire. The CFO's phone slipped from his hand, clattering against the floor. "They're suspending trading," he whispered. "The SEC has flagged us as compromised. We're frozen." Panic flared. Executives erupted into overlapping shouts, questions, denials, accusations. None of it mattered. The stock wasn't just falling, it had been halted. Strathmore Global, once worth billions, was now locked in freefall with no parachute. Damian's nephew tried to spin it, voice rising above the chaos. "We can control the narrative. Say it was sabotage. Frame Quell as the cause." But the system's automated report left no room for spin. It wasn't my code that had doomed them. It was Damian's command, recorded and transmitted as fact: "Security architect terminated mid-incident." A single line, enough to dismantle everything he had built his reputation upon. Damian's face drained of color. For the first time, he looked less like a CEO and more like a man watching his empire dissolve through his own fingers. He opened his mouth, but no words came. There was nothing left to deny. The room fell still, except for the relentless ticking of the clock. Every second stretched the gap wider between what Strathmore had been and what it was becoming. A cautionary tale, a headline, a collapse born not from outside attack, but from the hubris of its leader. The cafe across from Strathmore's glass tower was almost empty, save for the low hum of an espresso machine and the occasional clink of ceramic cups. I slid into a corner booth, my laptop still sealed shut in my bag. For the first time in hours, my hands were still, though they trembled slightly when I reached for the mug in front of me. The coffee was hot, bitter, strong, but my grip faltered, a reminder that my body was still shaking with adrenaline I had nowhere to spend. On the mounted television above the counter, The news ticker screamed what my heart already knew: Strathmore stock suspended. Billions wiped out. Emergency board meeting underway. A shaky camera feed showed the crowd gathering outside the tower, reporters, analysts, bystanders craning their necks to witness history written in real time. I watched from across the street like an exile staring at her former home. Just hours ago, I had been inside, fighting tooth and nail to keep the fortress standing. Now I was a stranger with no badge, no title, no anchor. The tower glittered in the morning sun, but to me it looked hollow, like a glass tomb sealed around arrogance and betrayal. My phone buzzed constantly with messages from former colleagues. "Are you okay?" One wrote. "They're blaming you on the floor." I didn't answer. Each vibration was another tug-of-war between rage and restraint. I wanted to scream back that they had seen me humiliated, stripped of dignity in front of them, and said nothing. They let Damian erase me while I was saving them. Now they wanted reassurance. I sipped the coffee, letting the bitterness steady me. The loneliness pressed heavy against my chest. For 15 years, Strathmore had been my second home, nights spent hunched over servers, mornings chasing contracts across time zones, holidays on conference calls instead of with family. I had given the company my time, my health, my faith, and in the end I left through the lobby like a criminal while the people I trusted turned away. Quiet rage simmered inside me, controlled but sharp, not the kind that bursts into shouts, but the kind that freezes, that calcifies into memory, rage that doesn't fade, rage that waits. On the television, a commentator's voice broke through. The SEC report states the security architect of record was terminated during the active breach. That clause alone is catastrophic. This is unprecedented in corporate history. I lowered my gaze to the coffee surface, watching the ripples steady. Their empire was falling, not because of the hackers, not because of me, but because Damian's vanity had triggered the very safeguards I created. The irony would have been poetic if it hadn't been carved out of my own humiliation. Another buzz, this one different. A new message from an unknown number. Just 5 words: "You planned this, didn't you?" I stared at the screen, my pulse spiking. The words burned brighter than any headline. Planned this? No. I had built systems to protect Strathmore, not destroy it. Yet the question lingered, chilling in its implication. Someone believed the collapse wasn't an accident. Someone thought I had orchestrated it. I set the phone down, fingers tight around the edge of the table. For a moment, the loneliness deepened into something else: doubt. The collapse was bigger than me, bigger than Damian. The breach, the safeguards, the insurance, all threads in a web I thought I controlled. But what if there were pieces I hadn't seen? The television cut to live footage of Damian storming through the lobby, cameras chasing him, reporters shouting accusations. My reflection in the cafe window overlapped with his figure on the screen, 2 faces divided by glass and circumstance. I exhaled slowly, the rage settling into silence. Alone in that booth, I realized I was no longer part of Strathmore's story. Yet somehow Strathmore was still part of mine. The war room was no longer a place of strategy, it had become a cage filled with voices clawing over each other. Damian Aldridge stood at the center, red-faced and trembling, barking orders like a general whose army had already deserted him. "Find the sabotage," he roared, slamming his palm against the table so hard the pens scattered. "She planted something in the code. I want it uncovered now." His nephew echoed him, voice shrill with panic. "Check every line. Quell had access to everything. She's been waiting for this moment to stab us in the back." The IT staff hunched over their screens, sweat running down their temples as lines of code flashed across monitors. But there was nothing hidden, no poison script waiting to be found. It was the same architecture they had worked with for years, the one I had built to protect them. Damian turned next on the lawyers. "You're supposed to defend me. Draft a statement. Tell the regulators this was deliberate sabotage, a betrayal. Put her name in bold letters." One of the attorneys tried to keep his voice steady. "Sir, we can't fabricate evidence. The automated SEC report already shows the termination order came from your office. They'll ask why a security architect was dismissed mid-incident." Damian's fist slammed again. Spin it. Say she quit. Say she was unstable. I don't care what story you use, just bury a scapegoat before the board arrives. Phones buzzed around the room. Insurance representatives refused claims. Regulators demanded explanations. Journalists hammered for statements. Each call added another layer of chaos, voices rising, hands gesturing, papers scattered across the table like fallen leaves. No one could focus. Finally, the lead IT engineer, a man who had worked under me for a decade, spoke up. His voice was quiet, but it cut through the clamor like a blade. "We've finished combing the system," he said. "There's no sabotage." Damian spun toward him. "What do you mean no sabotage?" "Of course there is. Look at the meltdown happening around us. Do you think that's coincidence?" The engineer shook his head. "The system isn't broken. It's functioning exactly as designed. The deep lock was programmed to activate if the architect of record was removed during an active breach. That's what happened. The order to terminate her credentials came from this office. The system responded accordingly." The words fell like a gavel. For a moment, no one breathed. Damian staggered back as if the air had been knocked out of him. "No, you're lying. She must have left traps, hidden conditions, something." But the IT team backed their colleague one by one. They nodded, showing their screens. No hidden scripts, no unauthorized code. Everything traced back to the termination command. Denial still clung to Damian like armor he refused to shed. "This is her fault," he spat. "She built a system designed to punish us. She wanted this. She's been plotting against me from the beginning." The CFO finally snapped, his voice cutting across the storm. "She didn't punish us, Damian. You did. You fired her at the worst possible moment. The system did exactly what she said it would do. You ignored her warnings. Now we're paying the price." The room fell into a tense, electric silence. The chaos hadn't ended, but it had shifted. The denial was Damian's alone now, clinging to him while everyone else stared at the truth laid bare on the monitors. Strathmore wasn't collapsing because of sabotage. It was collapsing because its leader couldn't admit he had pulled the trigger himself. The boardroom smelled faintly of sweat and burnt coffee. Executives crowded around the long mahogany table, their ties loosened, their faces pale. Everyone had been summoned for the emergency call. The collapse outside was accelerating, but inside, Damian Aldridge strutted as if he still held the reins. He stormed to the head of the table, gesturing toward the massive screen at the front. "Enough of this panic," he declared, his voice booming with manufactured confidence. "I've restored the system. Strathmore is back under control." Gasps rippled through the room, heads lifted. Some dared to exchange glances of relief, fragile smiles flickering like candles in the dark. The screen came alive with a dashboard that pulsed with green indicators, servers online, transaction flow steady, treasury nodes stable. For a moment, the nightmare seemed to recede. "There," Damian said, spreading his arms wide. "You see, the so-called irreversible collapse was nothing more than fearmongering. I told you, we are resilient. The market will rebound. Regulators will calm. All we needed was decisive leadership." He looked around with a predator's grin, daring anyone to contradict him. His nephew leaned forward, feeding the illusion. "This proves Quell's sabotage narrative was a lie. The system is fine without her." The room shifted. The CFO straightened in his chair. A board member exhaled loudly, muttering, "Thank God." For the first time in hours, people allowed themselves to believe they might survive this storm. But beneath the surface, dread clung to those who knew better. The IT engineers sat stiff at the side of the room, their eyes darting toward the screen. None of them spoke, not yet. Minutes crawled by. Damian basked in his own theater, reassuring the board with the ease of a man selling a story he almost believed. This company will emerge stronger. Investors will see that Strathmore does not falter under pressure. Then it happened. A faint flicker crossed the dashboard, so quick it might have been dismissed as a glitch, but the green indicators began to waver. One by one, transaction flows froze. Server icons dimmed. The treasury nodes blinked uncertainly. And then, with a final hiccup, the entire screen went black. A single error message appeared in stark white letters: data cache expired. No live connection found. Silence swallowed the room. The illusion shattered. One engineer finally spoke, his voice cutting through the dread. That dashboard wasn't real time. It was cached data from before the deep lock sealed. The system was never restored. Those indicators were ghosts. The CFO's chair scraped against the floor as he shot to his feet. You mean the accounts are still locked? Yes, the engineer confirmed, his voice steady but his eyes betraying the weight of it. Every account, every treasury node, every contract, completely sealed. Without Quell's authorization, nothing can be moved. The company is paralyzed. The board erupted in outrage, voices collided, overlapping accusations, curses, frantic demands for answers. You lied to us, Damian, one shouted. Another pounded the table. You humiliated her, and now you've humiliated us. Damian's mask cracked, but only for an instant. He raised his hands, shouting over the storm. This is temporary, just another obstacle. I told you we will find a way in. But the words rang hollow. The false hope he had offered minutes earlier now curdled into betrayal. The board had tasted relief, only to have it ripped away. The collapse no longer felt distant. It was here in the room with them, undeniable. The CFO's voice trembled with fury. You paraded cached data as salvation. You lied in the middle of catastrophe. Do you understand what that means for our credibility, for our survival? No one waited for Damian's answer. Phones lit up again, this time with more desperate calls, regulators demanding explanations, investors screaming about frozen capital, journalists circling like vultures. The reality pressed in. Strathmore wasn't merely wounded, it was comatose, locked inside a vault whose key had walked out the door. Damian sank back into his chair. The swagger drained, denial still clung to him like armor, but the board no longer looked at him as a leader. They looked at him as the man who had just driven them over the cliff, smiling all the way down. The false victory had lasted less than 10 minutes. The collapse would last forever. The emergency board meeting was called before the echoes of Damian's false dashboard had even faded. The mahogany doors of the executive chamber slammed shut, sealing an air heavy with panic. Investors had begun to pull out within minutes of the trading halt. Entire funds were scrambling to liquidate positions while Strathmore stock remained frozen, its value hanging in limbo. Around the long table, board members wore the look of people watching their fortunes bleed out. Some whispered furiously into phones. Others simply stared at Damian, waiting for a miracle explanation he no longer had. Damian adjusted his tie, his movement stiff, his eyes darting from face to face. He opened with the same hollow confidence he had clung to all morning. Ladies and gentlemen, I assure you, this situation is temporary. The markets are overreacting. Strathmore has survived worse. Worse? The word shot back like a bullet from Margaret Hale, one of the oldest and most respected board members. Her eyes blazed. Worse than $6.2 billion locked away? Worse than the SEC report that says you terminated your chief architect during a live breach? Tell me, Damian, when exactly have we seen worse? The room stirred, voices rose. Another member slammed his hand flat on the table. Our investors are in freefall. I just got off the phone with Harrington Capital, they're pulling out completely. Do you have any idea what that means? Damian tried to wave it off, though sweat glistened at his temples. Investors are emotional. Once we stabilize the narrative, once the system is back online, stabilize the narrative? Margaret's voice cut in again, sharp and relentless. You lied to us about the dashboard. You told us the system was restored when it wasn't. You paraded cached data as proof. Do you realize what that did to our credibility? Murmurs of agreement swelled. The walls of denial Damian had tried to erect were crumbling, brick by brick. The CFO's phone buzzed violently on the table. He glanced at the screen, then looked up with a pale face. Another major investor just pulled out. If this continues, we won't just be frozen, we'll be gutted. This company is seconds away from insolvency. For the first time, genuine fear cracked Damian's expression. His voice rose, desperate now. You think this is my fault? No, this was sabotage. Quell wanted this. She built a system designed to punish us. But then came the twist that silenced the room. Margaret slid a printed sheet across the table. Her hands did not shake, though her voice carried the weight of revelation. 3 weeks ago, Maren Quell sent this email to the board liaison office. I've just had it pulled from archives. It is marked urgent. You never forwarded it, Damian. The paper sat in the center like a loaded gun. Board members leaned forward to read. The words were clear, damning. If the chief architect of record is terminated during an active incident, the deep lock protocol will seal Treasury systems. No access, no insurance activation, no recovery without architect authorization. Recommend dual signatory redundancy to avoid catastrophic failure. Gasps spread around the table. Some members covered their mouths, others cursed under their breath. The warning had been given, explicit, precise, undeniable. Margaret's eyes locked on Damian's. She told us. She told you. And you ignored it. Damian's lips moved, but no sound emerged at first. Finally he whispered, I never saw it. The CFO spat the words. You never read it because you didn't care. You wanted her gone, and now the company is bleeding out. The panic that had hovered at the edges of the room now engulfed it. Phones rang without pause. Chairs scraped. Voices erupted into accusations. The board no longer looked to Damian for answers. They looked at him as the reason their empire was burning. And through it all, the email lay in the center of the table, a silent monument to a warning discarded, a loyalty betrayed, and a collapse no one could now escape. The boardroom hadn't quieted since the revelation of Maren's ignored email. Phones buzzed without pause. Executives barked into headsets, and assistants rushed in with updates that only darkened the mood. Strathmore was unraveling in real time. Then came the call. The conference line crackled as the faces of 3 of Strathmore's largest institutional investors appeared on the screen. These were not reporters or regulators who could be dodged with spin. These were men and women who controlled billions, people Damian had courted with handshakes and promises of bulletproof security. Their expressions were glacial. Mr. Aldridge, began the spokesperson from Halberton Trust, his tone clipped. We need explanations now. Damian straightened, tugging at his cuffs as though polished fabric could restore authority. What you're seeing is market hysteria. The fundamentals of Strathmore remain strong. The breach is contained, and we're moving toward a rapid restoration. Contained? Rapid restoration? The phrases landed with the hollowness of a drumbeat in an empty hall. The second investor, a woman from Redwood Capital, leaned forward, her eyes sharp. You told us this system was unassailable. You assured us our capital was protected under every scenario. Yet here we are, accounts frozen, insurance void, regulators circling. Was your assurance incompetence or deception? Damian's mouth twitched. Neither. This was sabotage, a trusted employee turned rogue, weaponizing her access against us. It was the same lie he had clung to all morning. But on the investor call, it shrank into something pathetic. The spokesperson from Halberton Trust held up a folder. We received a forwarded copy of Ms. Quell's prior communication to the board. Her email outlined exactly what would happen if the architect of record was terminated mid-incident. She even recommended redundancy to avoid this very scenario. That doesn't sound like sabotage. That sounds like foresight. The boardroom shifted, eyes widened, jaws clenched. Damian froze, but the blow had only begun. The Redwood Capital representative opened her own notes and read aloud, voice deliberate, every word sinking like a stone. She called the system bulletproof. You sold that to us. Without her, it's worthless. The sentence echoed in the chamber. The words, Maren's words, had been the very bait Damian dangled before investors, parading her brilliance as his achievement. Now, stripped of her, the promise was revealed for what it was: empty. Damian's face drained of color. He tried to interrupt, but the investor spoke over him. You misrepresented security you neither understood nor respected. You profited from her expertise, then discarded her. Now our capital is frozen, and your empire is rotting under its own arrogance. Vindication rippled quietly through the room. Board members exchanged looks, not of loyalty, but of recognition. The narrative had shifted. Damian was no longer the decisive leader fighting crisis. He was the liability, exposed before those whose trust mattered most. The CFO leaned forward, voice low but firm. They're right, Damian. You sold their faith in her work as your own, and when it mattered most, you cut her out. The investors did not wait for further defense. Our confidence in your leadership is gone, the Halberton spokesperson said flatly. We will be issuing statements to that effect. The market will know where the blame lies. The call ended with the hollow click of finality. In the boardroom, silence fell heavier than any alarm. Damian stood frozen, a man stripped bare, his credibility collapsing faster than the stock outside. And though I wasn't there to see it, I knew for the first time the truth of my worth was undeniable. The vindication had begun to brew. By the time the sun shifted past the glass facade of Strathmore's tower, the empire was already in freefall. Trading remained halted, the value of the company hemorrhaging in investor forecasts, while regulators filed into the lobby with clipboards and grim expressions. Outside, reporters gathered in clusters, their cameras pointed upward like vultures circling a wounded beast. Inside the boardroom, Damian Aldridge sat slumped at the head of the table, his tie loosened, sweat darkening his collar. The bravado that once filled his voice had shriveled into hoarse denials. Around him, board members spoke not in whispers but in sharp, open condemnation. You lied about stability. You cost us billions. You humiliated this company in front of the world. Every accusation struck like a gavel. Damian tried to parry with the same excuses: sabotage, disloyalty, misinterpretation, but the room no longer entertained illusions. He was no longer their shield. He was the liability dragging them into ruin. The CFO slid a folder across the polished wood. We've already spoken to counsel. For the sake of this board, this company, and what remains of shareholder confidence, you must resign immediately. Damian's head snapped up. Resign? You expect me to abandon the company I built? Margaret Hale's voice cut like steel. You didn't build it. You exploited the people who did. And now you've destroyed it. The board will not fall with you. Phones buzzed. Notifications flashed. Another blow landed as news outlets published damning leaks. Regulators confirmed Strathmore had failed to disclose systemic vulnerabilities. While investors prepared legal action, the legal noose was tightening. Damian's nephew muttered at his side, "We can fight this." But the fight was already lost. Then came the final strike. An assistant rushed in, face pale, clutching a printed document freshly circulated through the press. She set it on the table, her hand trembling. "It's out," she whispered. The board leaned forward. On the page was Damian's own termination order, the command that stripped my credentials. At the top in bold digital print was the timestamp, 9:43 a.m. The proof was undeniable. Damian had not only fired me mid-crisis, he had signed the order at the precise moment the deep lock protocol triggered. He had deleted the only token that could have saved Strathmore. Margaret read the line aloud, her voice carrying the weight of final judgment. Authorization revoked. Quell, M. Timestamp 9:43 a.m. The words echoed in the room like a death sentence. There was no spinning, no scapegoat. The collapse was not sabotage, not misfortune, but the direct result of Damian's arrogance. One board member exhaled sharply. It's over. He killed the system himself. Damian's face contorted, his mouth worked soundlessly before collapsing into a growl. They'll believe me. They'll know she. No, Margaret interrupted coldly. The world has seen the document. They believe the timestamp. They believe the system's report. And none of it points to her. It points to you. Outside, the press was already screaming the headline across tickers: Strathmore CEO fired architect at 9:43 a.m., collapse triggered by own order. The image of the document with its merciless timestamp was plastered across every outlet within minutes. The board didn't wait for Damian's consent. The CFO announced it flatly, like cutting a cord. Effective immediately, Damian Aldridge is removed as Chief Executive Officer. The words left Damian hollow. He sagged back into his chair. The power he had clung to drained away. Outside the window, cameras flashed like lightning as reporters closed in for his downfall. Justice had come, ruthless and swift, not in whispers or speculation, but in hard, printed proof. The man who thought himself untouchable was undone by his own signature, burned into history at 9:43 a.m. The storm around Strathmore raged for weeks, but I was no longer inside its walls. I watched from a distance as Damian's empire fractured under lawsuits, regulatory sanctions, and the relentless glare of the press. Each headline carved his arrogance deeper into history. 9:43 a.m., the moment Strathmore collapsed. Yet while they buried him, doors began to open for me. Calls came in from government agencies, from rival firms, from global alliances that had once treated me as invisible background. The tone was different now, measured, respectful, curious. They didn't want me as an employee to be used and discarded. They wanted me as an authority, a voice that could shape the future of cybersecurity at the highest level. One call in particular stood out. It wasn't just an offer of employment, it was an invitation to leadership. A global consortium of financial and security institutions asked me to become their senior advisor, guiding protections that spanned continents. It was more than a promotion. It was recognition that my work, my foresight, had value that could not be erased by arrogance. For a moment, I hesitated. 15 years at Strathmore had taught me the cost of loyalty to the wrong leader. I had poured myself dry for a company that repaid me with humiliation. Could I truly start again? Then I remembered the young analyst's whisper in the lobby, "We trust you, not him." Those words, fragile at the time, had become a compass. Trust had not been destroyed. It had only been misplaced, and now, at last, it was being restored. I accepted. The day I walked into my new office, the air felt different. Sunlight streamed through tall windows, falling across polished wood and silent screens waiting to be configured. This space wasn't haunted by betrayal. It was alive with possibility. I set down my bag and placed a small object on the desk, the watch I had worn since my first day at Strathmore. It had been a gift from my parents, a symbol of beginnings and resilience. For years I had checked that watch during endless nights. Its ticking was a reminder that time sacrificed for Strathmore was time I could never reclaim. Now its presence felt heavier, tied not to pride but to pain. Slowly I unfastened the strap, letting the old watch rest flat on the desk. My hand lingered on it, acknowledging the years it represented, before I pushed it gently aside. In its place, the assistant brought in a new plaque, simple, sharp, etched in steel letters that gleamed against the light: Chief Architect Marin Quell, Systems Built on Integrity. The sight stole my breath. It wasn't just a title. It was vindication. It was ownership. It was proof that survival was not enough, that dignity, once taken, could be reclaimed and redefined. As I leaned back in my chair, a quiet catharsis spread through me. Damian had once strutted under the illusion of control, but he never held respect. He demanded it, purchased it, manipulated it, but he never earned it. Now I sat in a position even higher than his had been. And what I carried was something he could never touch: genuine respect, freely given, for the first time in years. I felt whole, not a ghost erased by arrogance, not a soldier abandoned on the battlefield, but a leader in my own right. The silence of the office was not loneliness. It was peace. I closed my eyes for a moment and thought of every night I had worked unseen, every humiliation swallowed, every sacrifice made invisible. They hadn't been wasted. They had led me here, to a place where my name was no longer hidden in code but engraved in steel. When I opened them again, the plaque shone like a promise. Sometimes justice doesn't arrive with fireworks. Sometimes it arrives quietly, with truth exposed and respect restored. My story is proof. Dignity can be stolen, but it can also be reclaimed.